Hi, everybody. This is Christy Drexler, along with Kristen Morehead and Jeff Longwell. We're going to be presenting to you on the article Understanding the Cost of Public Higher Education by McPherson and Schulenberger, published in 2010. So this was an interesting article which examined a 20-year trend in the cost of public higher education through 2007. So just keep in mind that the data is a little bit old. Interestingly, their findings indicate that the cost of education hasn't really increased at all in 20 years. So yes, you heard that right. Their findings indicate the cost of education has not increased at all in 20 years. But wait, can that be true? I mean, we've been hearing a lot and living the truth that college tuition has been rising. The cost of education for students has been rising. And a lot of times we blame the institutional administrators of mismanagement. But as this and other research shows, that's actually not the case. So during the presentation, we'll focus on 3 key findings of the article and then determine if, and if so how, the findings may be beneficial to 4 different groups, so 4 different points of view, from legislators, administrators, faculty staff, and students. And then we'll also incorporate recent articles into our discussion of key findings. And then at the end, conclude with honing in on special considerations for New Mexico. So I'm going to present key finding number 1, tuition versus the cost of education. An interesting term used in this article is multiversities. And basically what that means is for each public research university, there's a delivery of 2 products. One is educational programs, and the second is self-financed activities. That can be things like sports, clinics, and other externally funded research, other things like that. Kristen Morehead will present specifically on those key findings. My part here is focused on the educational program wing of the multiversity. So what that means, the educational programs means the academic side. The consumer being the student and the producer being the faculty and instructional delivery. So I want to take a moment here to talk about an important distinction. Tuition, it's the price of college that the students pay at public institutions. That has been increasing. That's not what the authors are talking about. The authors are actually talking about cost of education, which is teaching and instruction. Has that increased? The authors are saying over the last 20 years that cost has actually not increased, or it has remained steady. So that might explain a lot actually with regard to frustrations of faculty salary not increasing and things of that nature. So with that in context, the authors McPherson and Schulenberger are trying to say that over the last 20 years, educational program cost or the instructional expenses in general has been constant and steady. It has not been increasing or exceeding the inflation rate of the consumer price index. So the problem really lies here. Although the cost of education has been steady, and the tuition that has been coming in has been available to pay for these educational programs, the state government appropriations, which is also a large percentage of this ability to pay for those educational programs, has declined. So the state appropriations per student has declined, which is a problem. And unlike private institutions, which rely a lot on gifts and large endowments to help fund the instructional activities, public institutions have relied heavily, extensively in some cases, on state appropriations. And so what happens when appropriations decrease or there's a threat of appropriations veto? What happens is tuitions go up to fill the gap. So if appropriations decrease, tuitions have to go up to fill that gap. And as we all know, increasing tuition, it's bad for business all around. Colleges might have to cut programs or cut positions, salaries. There's more information on this in the article from the SHEO data, SHEEO data, on page 607. And there's also some snazzy charts you should take a look at on expenses, private versus public, and other income versus expenses on page 604 and 608 of the article, of the textbook. So could this be true? Could education costs, instructional expenditures, could that actually be consistent over the last 20 years? Well, along with many other cited references in this article and a dissertation by Dr. Ann Milkovich just last year, she thinks that it is true. She also thinks that the best thing the university administrators could be doing right now is to be reprioritizing programs to increase institutional performance. So this move would actually proactively manage the cycle rather than reacting to fiscal crises or other external pressures. Also, she thinks that portfolio management, similar to that of private industry, would be helpful. Further, she thinks that speaking the truth and lobbying for increased funds would also be helpful. It's important to know here, though, if you're going the performance indicators route, if you're going to reprioritize programs according to performance indicators, you have to be comparing like institutions. So institutions with like characteristics, mission, and discipline, not comparing apples to oranges, say New Mexico State versus a private fine arts institution. So then who benefits from the study's findings? Not surprisingly, the administration benefits from the findings, but keep in mind that the authors of this article are top administrators. They're president and vice president of an institution. So I don't know. In my opinion, there are other limiting factors too, other than potential bias. The data is old. It's at least 10 years old. They make assumptions about students choosing tuition as if there could be a choice of institutions and paying tuition at the level they wish. And then I thought that the tone of the article was perhaps a bit oversimplified, not taking into account socioeconomic indicators or other important things. So I think that the institutional leaders, administrators definitely benefit from the study's findings. Legislators also benefit, I think could benefit if they don't cut state appropriations. They could be seen as heroes. Also, the administrators could be seen as heroes. They're no longer what people think is to be blamed for institutional mismanagement and tuition hikes. They can actually do something proactive and form an intervention or improve institutional performance with the reprioritization, as Dr. Milkovich had discussed in her dissertation. They can refine the framework of institutional portfolio management. They can actually be the good guy here. But I think that the faculty and staff and students are the ones who don't benefit from the findings of this article. Not surprising, I suppose. The academic side. So the producers, the instruction providers, and the consumers, the students, don't benefit. It seems that when there are financial difficulties, there are cuts to programs, salaried positions, etc. So although this article paints a picture for us not to worry, I think that there were some limitations in the study that can make us a bit critical of this article. So that concludes the educational program key finding, tuition and cost of education. Now for self-financed activities part of the multiversity.
In higher education finance, and examine some of the associated challenges and assumptions presented in the article by McPherson and Schulenberger. This article examines the cost of educational programs versus self-financed activities. Self-financed activities are discussed very briefly in this article, but they comprise a very large portion of educational budgets. The primary funding model examined in this article are state appropriations, self-financed programs, and private funds. State appropriations, as described by Christy, are allocated by the state to support educational costs, such as teaching. Self-finance programs include a large variety of programs that happen and take place at universities, including auxiliaries, clinics, athletics, technology transfer activities, externally funded research, some student support services, housing, health clinics, etc. Lots and lots of things are covered under this section. Additionally, there's private funds such as gifts that can be used in unrestricted ways. So the challenges to these funding models, this type of funding model often creates funding silos, specifically in the case of self-finance programs, because revenue from the programs is generally only put back into the program that generated the money. State appropriations are sometimes used in self-finance activities to support staff positions. There is also a general assumption about the impact of private funds and self-finance programs that they generate large revenue that can be allocated to other areas of the institution. This is not always the case. As McPherson and Schulenberger explain, private funds over the last 20 years on average have contributed only between $300 and $700 annually to student costs per student. Self-finance program funds are generally not allocated to educational costs. Lastly, another challenge, this article only examines costs at major research institutions, which raised the question for me, what are the implications for community colleges or non-research institutions that don't have as robust of an auxiliary research technology transfer athletic programs? The last section to explore is who benefits from this structure. Legislators benefit from this structure under the assumption that universities do have robust budgets when they look at the combined budget of educational program, or the combined costs and budgets of educational programs and self-finance activities. But the challenge is that legislators often lack a clear understanding that self-finance funds are not allocated to educational costs. This can lead to confusion about budgets and to the assumption that there is less need for state appropriations. Administrators benefit from this structure but are also disadvantaged in some senses. The self-finance programs do not always fall. One of the benefits is that self-finance programs do not always fall within the purview of financial challenges because many are self-sufficient and generate enough money to sustain themselves. But administrators are also tasked with explaining to different stakeholders that these funds are not allocated into the cost of educational budget and don't often go back to supporting educational positions or supporting needs. Lastly, students also have benefits and challenges with this system because many self-finance programs contribute to campus life, such as health clinics, performing arts centers, sporting events, certain student services, student support services. But one of the challenges is that some of these funds are pulled from student fees. So the last section we'll talk about is who is talking about this now. I found two articles, one from CERNA 2015 and the other from Madsen, also 2015. And they examine different aspects of the challenges of financing and budgeting in higher education. CERNA looks at an overview of the effects of state oversight and fiscal policy of university revenue, while Madsen presents a case study of expenditure and revenue at Northern Iowa State. Something that was interesting to note as well, both articles discuss challenges of funding in higher education as it relates to costs and declining state appropriations. They both also discuss how auxiliary programs and self-financed activities in some instances are pulling funding from student fees. So these programs are also pulling a little bit of money from the educational costs. That is the end of this section, and we'll go on to Jeff. Thank you for your time.
Where does tuition actually go? And the McPherson article talks about different places that it goes. Basically, we understand that for public universities, The tuition partially goes to replace the appropriations that are being cut by state and federal sources, and it really doesn't replace all of the money that used to come from those places. So it's still at a shortfall. Since we've been talking about public and private things, private contributions do happen to public universities, though they represent a small portion of the budget. From NMSU budget website, they indicate that only 3 to 8% of the budget comes from private sources. So combining that with tuition increases doesn't make up for the cuts in appropriations. Private universities have a benefit when it comes to tuition because they're able to apply any tuition increases directly to educational expenditures, so we can say that students see the direct effects of an increase in tuition. One of the interesting questions that I thought of as I was reading the article is the authors state that a university is able to choose what kind of university they want to be. And the question is that really the case? Can a university really decide what it wants to be without adequate support? And that would be a good question maybe for our discussion board if you want to answer that. But we have to take into consideration quality of education and research that's offered. I'm going to talk a little bit about the considerations for New Mexico. I found this article from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C. about how states are still funding higher ed at below recession levels post-recession. This article is from 2014, so it's a little more up to date, but maybe not the most recent. It is, however, more recent than the 2010 article that we read. The numbers from this report that are on the slide here apply to New Mexico only. It has numbers for all 50 states in the U.S. And you'll see the numbers broken down into during the recession period and immediately following the recession period as far as increases and decreases are concerned. You'll see that New Mexico was third worst in the country for decreasing spending per student at 34.2%, $4,500 more or less. State spending per student since the recession has increased slightly at $477. During the recession, tuition change, we had an increase of 25.4%, and since the recession, a slight increase of only 3.9%. Now, most recently, we've had a couple of tuition increases at NMSU. These in 2015, we had a 2.4% increase, or $71 per semester, and just this week, June 12th, 13th, the regents announced that there would be a tuition increase of 6%, which implies $184 per semester for 12 credits, or $197 for 15 credits. Interestingly enough, this 6% number that's on there is the maximum amount that the AS-NMSU contract with NMSU allows. So where in 2015 they went for a minimum increase, in 2017 they're going for a maximum. What does that imply? It implies that, as according to the report by Mitchell, Palacios, and Leachman in 2014, that students are paying almost 50% of the costs of education, whereas before they weren't. It was heavily subsidized. And another implication of that is that tuition growth has outpaced the median income gains, which means lower income students are not able to afford higher education, and that becomes a problem. And here you'll see our references. You'll see the second text on the references is our original text with McPherson reading about higher ed costs. Our additional articles that we found are Madison, Milkovich, Mitchell, and Serna. And we included here just the NMSU Regents report and U.S. News and World Report about NMSU specific costs.